Now, getting back to the original question about daily caffeine consumption, this person goes on to say that for them, okay, this is their personal experience, after a few weeks of consumption of daily caffeine, the negatives start to outweigh the positive ones. They're getting poor quality sleep, lack of appetite, anxiety, etc. And when they don't consume caffeine, they find it a lot easier to be mindful and their meditation practice is much better, but they're lethargic and less motivated. Okay, so what they're describing are all the classic symptoms of caffeine overuse. Probably not abuse in this case, although caffeine can be truly abused. People taking caffeine pills, etc., in large quantities. We're not talking about that. But this person is describing the classic pattern of overuse of caffeine and the classic pattern of withdrawal from caffeine when they stop taking it. So what should somebody like this do? And I think that's an important question to answer because I think a lot of people fall into this category. They drink caffeine every day. They're no longer getting the performance enhancing effect of caffeine, so they're taking it just to be normal or feel like they can focus normally and have normal amounts of energy. But then if they try and come off, they feel worse. Okay, there are a couple ways to do this. You can taper your caffeine intake off over the course of 4 to 7 days. But most people don't have the discipline or don't want to spend the time doing that. But if you want to, the way you would do that is you would cut it by about 10 or 15% per day. You could do that by volume or you could do that by concentration of coffee, that sort of thing. A simpler way to go about all this that still will allow you to get some of the performance enhancing effects of caffeine and yet experience far less withdrawal would be two things. First of all, just have your amount of caffeine intake for 2 or 3 days. So again, that could be by volume or it could be by concentration. Probably easiest to do by volume. And so instead of drinking an 8-ounce coffee in the morning, maybe you do 4 ounces of regular coffee, 4 ounces of decaf, or you just have the 4 ounces of coffee. You do that for 3 or 4 days, and then you take perhaps 1 full day off from caffeine, maybe another full day off. You're going to feel a lot less bad on those 2 days, having cut your caffeine intake in half in the previous 4 days than you would if you just went cold turkey. And then you go back to ingesting caffeine, but you go back to ingesting caffeine at that 50% dose, or what used to represent that 50% dose of caffeine for you. And you just continue that way on a daily basis. And then every once in a while, when you want the performance enhancing effects of caffeine, you go back to what was your original dose, which is now double what you're taking on a daily basis. So what we're really talking about here is not going cold turkey. We're not talking about quitting caffeine indefinitely. What we're talking about is cutting the amount of caffeine that you drink in half for about 4 days, okay, plus or minus a day, and then taking 2 days off from caffeine completely, and then going back on that half dose of caffeine indefinitely. That's your new baseline of caffeine intake. And then every once in a while, if you need a bit more of a lift, you ingest twice as much caffeine or a coffee that's twice as concentrated. We should acknowledge that most people aren't going to be really precise about the amount of ounces and the amount of caffeine. Nonetheless, it's pretty straightforward to know that you're reducing your caffeine intake. It certainly is clear to know if you're ingesting no caffeine for a couple of days. And it's pretty clear when you're doubling the amount of caffeine, but you don't have to worry so much that you're exactly doubling the amount of caffeine. You could drink 1.5 times as much as you happen to drink on the day before, or you could drink 3 times as much. You would definitely feel it if you drink 3 times as much. One very important thing to recognize is that on any day where you really spike your caffeine intake above baseline, no matter where that baseline is when you start, it could be 0, could be 400 milligrams, could be 200 milligrams. When you double that intake, you will get a big boost of energy, and the next day you're going to feel the crash from that. You're going to feel more lethargic. You're going to feel not so good. This has to do with dopamine receptor modulation. This has to do with adenosine receptor modulation. The important thing to do is not continue to consume that elevated level of caffeine, which is what most people do, and then they set a new higher baseline just to feel normal. The key thing is to just manage to get through that crash day, manage to get through that one day where you feel a little less good or maybe even down a bit. Get outside a bit, get some more sunshine. We know that spikes your cortisol in a good way, right? It can increase the catecholamines, dopamine, et cetera. Get a little bit more sunlight, get a little bit more movement, get outside, do something to offset those feelings of malaise, and then get right back to your original goal level of caffeine each day. There's no use in getting so quantitative that you make your life miserable, measuring things out like a laboratory chemist. If you're that type and you want to do that, be my guest. But unless you're taking caffeine in pill form, it's very, very hard to get extremely exact about the amounts of caffeine that you're ingesting. So it is okay to eyeball it, but understand the contour of how caffeine works and what the caffeine performance enhancing effect comes from. It comes from a caffeine intake above baseline. Understand that anytime you go above baseline with your caffeine intake, there's the potential of some anxiety. Understand that there's going to be a slight withdrawal effect that lasts about 24 to 48 hours. Battle through that short period, and you'll be right back where you started and where you need to be so that you can enjoy caffeine on a daily basis and derive the benefits, because there are many benefits to drinking caffeine, and avoiding some of the potential hazards. And again, if you're a young person, I recommend delaying that caffeine intake maybe, 10 years.